The forest at night is a different world. In the daytime, Rendlesham is nothing more than a stretch of pine and heathland in Suffolk, England. Birds call, branches sway. The air carries the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. But at night, it becomes something else. The trees stand tall and watchful. The shadows thicken, pressing close. And the silence, the kind of silence that makes you feel you are not alone, settles heavily across the forest floor. It was in such a silence, just after Christmas in 1980, that something descended into Rendlesham. The story begins on December 26, 1980. 2 nights after Christmas, at the height of the Cold War, American airmen were stationed at RAF Woodbridge, one of 2 bases in Suffolk leased to the United States Air Force. These were not ordinary men. They were trained, disciplined, tasked with watching the skies for signs of danger. But what they saw in Rendlesham Forest that night was nothing they had been prepared for. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Let yourself imagine being there. In uniform, standing guard at a foreign base, the winter air biting your face. When suddenly the night itself seems to shift. It began with lights. Strange lights in the distance, glowing where no lights should be. They pulsed, they flickered, they moved between the trees. At first, the guards thought perhaps an aircraft had gone down, a crash landing, a fire in the woods. That was the logical thought. And so, just past midnight, 3 men were sent to investigate. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, Airman First Class John Burroughs, and Airman Edward Cabansag. They walked into the forest, flashlights cutting through the trees, their boots pressed against frozen ground. The air smelled sharp, metallic. The night was unusually still, as though the forest itself was waiting. And then they saw it. Not a downed aircraft, not a fire, but a craft, triangular, metallic, resting on 3 legs pressed into the soil. Its surface shimmered faintly, glowing with colors that shifted and rippled like liquid light. Peniston approached first, his breath visible in the cold. He later said he touched the craft, that his hands pressed against a smooth surface, warm despite the winter air. He described strange symbols etched into the hull, markings that looked like hieroglyphs, unfamiliar, unearthly. Burroughs stood transfixed, light reflecting in his wide eyes. Cabansag, too, froze in place, unable to move closer. And then, in an instant, the craft lifted. It rose silently, without fire or sound, through the trees and into the sky. The men stood stunned, their breaths shallow, their hearts racing. When they returned to base, their words tumbled out, broken, frantic, unbelievable. A craft in the forest, symbols on its side, light, color, silence. Their superior officers listened, skeptical. But they could not ignore the men's fear. They could not ignore the reports of strange lights still moving in the woods. And so, the investigation continued. The next night, more would see it. Higher-ranking officers, more trained eyes. The mystery would deepen. But that first night, that first encounter, was enough to etch Rendlesham into history. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Let that image hold in your mind. A silent forest in Suffolk. 3 American airmen stumbling upon a glowing craft among the trees. A craft that shimmered, lifted, and vanished into the night sky. It was the beginning of a mystery Britain has never shaken, and the echoes of that night are still with us. A first night was enough to shake the men who saw it, but the story of Rendlesham did not end there. In truth, it was only the beginning. Because 2 nights later, on December 28th, the lights returned. This time there would be no simple report of 3 young airmen stumbling upon something they could not explain. This time a higher-ranking officer would go into the forest himself, a man who carried responsibility, who carried rank, who carried the authority of command. And that man was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the weight of his uniform, the cold of the winter air, the heavy silence of the forest as he led his men into the night. Colonel Halt did not go alone. He was joined by a small team of security personnel, equipped with radios, lights, even measuring devices. They intended not only to witness, but to record, to document, to bring back proof. And what they encountered in Rendlesham Forest became one of the most famous cases of UFO evidence ever captured. The night was cold, the trees tall, the ground frozen. The men moved carefully, their flashlights slicing thin beams through the dense woods. Their breath fogged in the air. And above them, between the branches, the lights appeared. Strange, glowing spheres. Red, blue, white, shifting, pulsing. They seemed to dance among the trees, floating, defying the natural order of the night. At times, they moved closer, so near the men felt their skin prickle with static. At other times, they darted away, faster than any human eye could follow. Colonel Halt was not a man given to fantasy. He spoke into a recorder, his calm military voice describing what he saw, moment by moment. That recording, still preserved today, is known as the Halt tape. In it, his words are steady, yet tinged with awe. He speaks of lights moving through the trees, of beams shining down from above, of something beyond explanation. Here it comes from the south. It's coming this way. It looks like it's dripping molten metal. It's bright red in color. It's coming this way. This is unreal. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Let yourself imagine standing in that line of men, hearing your commander's voice narrating the impossible, watching lights dart and hover in a way no aircraft could. At one point, one of the lights seemed to split apart, dividing into smaller orbs, each glowing with its own intensity, before merging again into one. At another, beams of light shone down directly onto the base itself. Not the forest, not the fields, but RAF Woodbridge, a military installation housing nuclear weapons. The men felt their skin crawl. What intelligence, human or otherwise, would direct beams of light toward a base built for war? The next day, evidence was found. At the site where Peniston claimed to have touched the craft 2 nights before, 3 indentations were discovered in the frozen soil. Triangular, evenly spaced, as though something heavy had rested there. Trees nearby showed unusual marks, scorched and burned as if by intense heat. Radiation levels were measured. In the indentations, they were significantly higher than the background of the forest. To skeptics, these details were easily dismissed. To believers, they were confirmation. But to those who had walked into the forest that night, to Colonel Halt and his men, there was no doubt. They had seen something. They had felt something, and no amount of denial could erase the memory of the lights moving between the trees. The Halt memo, the Halt tape, the indentations in the soil, these would become the heart of the Rendlesham case, debated for decades, studied, ridiculed, defended. But in the stillness of that night, none of that mattered. What mattered was the awe, the silence, the way the light seemed to breathe with the forest itself, and the way every man present felt deep in his bones that he was standing before something not of this world. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Hold that image. Because Rendlesham was no longer just a story told by 3 young airmen. Now it was a story carried by a colonel, by his own words, recorded in the moment, by physical marks pressed into the earth, by trees scarred and measured, by beams of light that defied the sky. This was not rumor. This was not hearsay. This was Britain's Roswell, and it was only growing louder. The lights faded. The forest grew still again. The air settled, heavy with the silence of night. The men returned to base, their minds restless, their bodies weary, their thoughts circling like birds in a storm. But Rendlesham was not finished with them. Because while lights can vanish, memory does not. And for those who had walked into that forest, Peniston, Burroughs, Halt, and the others, the silence became a companion they could never shake. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine yourself carrying that silence home, sitting alone in a small barracks room with nothing but the hum of a heater and the echo of what you had just seen. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, the man who claimed he touched the craft, never forgot the symbols. He described them carefully, lines and shapes etched into the hull, glowing faintly under his gloved fingers. Later, he sketched them in his notebook. Strange characters, geometric, unfamiliar. To him, they were not random. They were deliberate, purposeful, a language. And years later, he would reveal something even stranger. He said that when he touched the craft, a flood of information entered his mind. A sequence of numbers, endless, impossible to ignore. For years he kept it secret, scribbled in private, haunted by its presence. Eventually he released it. Pages of binary code, ones and zeros, dictated not by his hand, but by his memory. Some claimed it was gibberish. Others, decoding it, claimed it revealed coordinates of ancient sites, places of power scattered across the earth. Skeptics scoffed. Believers leaned forward. But for Peniston, it was never about proof. It was about the weight of carrying something no man should have to carry alone. Airman John Burroughs, who had stood beside him, carried another burden. He remembered the light, the way it pulsed, the way it wrapped itself around him. He remembered moving closer, unable to resist, as if drawn by something unseen. Years later, his health faltered. He fought for recognition, for acknowledgement that whatever happened in Rendlesham had left a mark not just on his mind, but on his body. Radiation exposure, he claimed, proof that the forest had left something inside him. And eventually, after long battles, his government agreed, granting him compensation. The first time a UFO encounter had ever been linked, officially, to military health consequences. And then there was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, a man of rank, a man of authority, a man trained to see the world in clear lines of order and command. He never wanted to believe in mysteries. He never wanted to be part of something so strange. Yet the forest did not ask for his permission. He carried a recorder that night. His words, steady and clipped, became history. "This is unreal," he said, "the red one's moving. And it looks like it's coming this way." Even decades later, his voice never wavered. He said what he saw was real, that beams of light had struck the ground, that something beyond explanation had happened in Rendlesham Forest. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Let the thoughts settle. 3 men, bound forever by one night. 3 men who could never fully escape what they had seen. Their stories were not identical. Memory shifts, details blur, experiences fracture. Skeptics seized upon those differences, pointing to contradictions as proof of lies. But believers understood. When the extraordinary collides with the human mind, memory bends. What mattered was not the details. What mattered was the silence in their eyes when they spoke, the way their voices carried weight, the way they returned, year after year, to the same truth. Something happened, something that could not be explained, and for each of them, it became a wound and a legacy. A wound because ridicule followed them. Whispers in military corridors, laughter in the press, suspicion from skeptics. A legacy because their names became forever tied to one of the greatest UFO mysteries in history. Close your eyes. Inhale deeply. Exhale slowly. Imagine what it is like to be ordinary, and then to be chosen by silence. To wake each day with the knowledge that you have seen something the world refuses to believe. That is what Rendlesham gave to Peniston, Burroughs, and Halt. Not answers, but weight. The weight of memory, the weight of ridicule, the weight of mystery. And through them, the story endured. Mysteries do not stay hidden forever. The night of strange lights in Rendlesham Forest could have remained nothing more than a whisper among airmen, a secret carried in silence, buried beneath military duty. But secrets leak. They always do, and this one was too bright to stay buried. For in the weeks and months after December 1980, the Rendlesham story began to move beyond the forest, beyond the bases, and into the wider world. It began with a memo. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, compelled by duty, by procedure, by the weight of command, put his experience into writing. His document, known today as the Halt Memo, was addressed to the British Ministry of Defense. It was brief, factual, and astonishing. Halt described the events as unexplained lights seen in Rendlesham Forest on 2 nights. He described the landing site, the indentations in the soil, the radiation readings, the scorched trees. He described beams of light shining down near the weapons storage area at RAF Woodbridge. There were no embellishments, no speculation, only the steady words of a military officer reporting what he and his men had witnessed. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine holding that paper in your hands. Official stationery, a cool tone of authority, describing something utterly extraordinary. The Ministry of Defense filed it away. Their conclusion, years later, would be that the lights posed no threat to national security. A phrase repeated often, as if to close the door, as if to suggest that something not threatening could also not be real. But the memo was not forgotten. In the mid-1980s, through Britain's Freedom of Information Act, the document surfaced. Reporters seized upon it. Researchers highlighted it. For the first time, the Rendlesham case was no longer just rumor. It had an official record, and that record used the words, unexplained lights. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Let the weight of those words settle in your mind. Not dismissed. Not denied. Unexplained. The Halt memo was joined by something else. The Halt tape. Colonel Halt had carried a small recorder into the forest. On that second night, as he and his men moved between the trees, he described what he saw into the device. His voice, clipped and military, narrated the impossible. The tape was eerie. The object is flashing to the left. Red and blue lights. It looks like an eye winking at you. It's coming this way. This is unreal. In the distance, men's voices rise, nervous, disbelieving. At one point, Halt describes a beam of light coming down near them. Decades later, listening to that tape still chills the spine, because it is not the words of a believer or a skeptic. It is the voice of a commander describing in the moment what his eyes could not reconcile. Together, the Halt memo and the Halt tape became the backbone of Rendlesham's legend. But there was more. Local police reports were unearthed. On the first night, Suffolk constabulary had been called to the forest. They found nothing unusual, only the play of lights, they said, likely from Orford Ness Lighthouse, which stood across the coast, its beams sweeping rhythmically across the trees. Skeptics latched on to this explanation. A lighthouse, nothing more. The men had been fooled, but believers pushed back. A lighthouse beam does not leave triangular indentations in soil. A lighthouse does not raise radiation levels. A lighthouse does not split into spheres of light, dance through trees, or send beams down into a weapons facility. And the men themselves, Peniston, Burroughs, Halt, never accepted the lighthouse explanation, because they knew what they had seen. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Think of the tension that grew then, in those years when the documents began to surface. The ministry saying no threat, the police pointing to a lighthouse, the witnesses holding steady in their story, researchers asking more questions, reporters writing more headlines. And so, Rendlesham left the forest and entered history. It was no longer just an encounter whispered about on a base. It was now part of Britain's official record. A memo, a tape, a case, and it would never fade again. Once the memo surfaced, the silence broke. What had lived only in whispers between servicemen and their families, what had been filed away in an office at the Ministry of Defense, now spilled into the world, and the world was ready to listen. The 1980s were years of strange skies. Reports of UFOs were not rare. Newspapers occasionally ran stories of lights, of sightings, of unusual encounters. But most were fleeting, lacking depth, soon forgotten. Rendlesham was different, because Rendlesham had names. Rendlesham had tape. Rendlesham had a memo stamped with official ink. And suddenly, the forest of Suffolk became the stage for something larger than Britain itself. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the feeling of seeing a headline for the first time. Unexplained lights at RAF base. Imagine the ripple of curiosity, the quiet thrill of possibility. The press began to circle. At first, local papers, then national ones, then international journalists, each eager to capture the story of Britain's own Roswell. The nickname caught quickly. In the United States, Roswell had already become synonymous with secrecy, cover-up, the suggestion of a crashed craft hidden away. Britain had no such legend, until now. Britain's Roswell. The phrase appeared in newspapers, in documentaries, in late-night conversations across pubs and living rooms. And with it came debate. Television brought Rendlesham into living rooms. In 1983, the story exploded in America through the tabloid News of the World, which published the Halt memo. Soon, UFO researchers in the US and Britain were interviewing witnesses, airing their words, playing the Halt tape to late-night audiences. The story gained momentum. Books appeared. Conferences featured Rendlesham as a central case. Some researchers hailed it as one of the most credible UFO encounters of all time. Multiple witnesses, military background, physical evidence, official documentation. It was, they said, the holy grail of UFO stories. Skeptics sharpened their arguments. They said it was a lighthouse, again and again. They said men had been confused by stars, by meteors, by stress. They said memory had twisted, grown, distorted with time. But the voices of those who were there never softened. Peniston, Burroughs, Halt, they continued to speak. Halt himself, a colonel, hardly a man seeking fame, hardly a man prone to fantasy, said flatly, "I saw what I saw." The public leaned closer, and through the 1980s and 1990s, Rendlesham transformed into more than an event. It became a symbol of secrecy, because many believed the Ministry of Defense knew more than they admitted. A symbol of wonder, because the story carried with it details that felt undeniable. A symbol of division, because skeptics refused to let go of the lighthouse explanation, while believers clung to the testimonies and the tape. Breathe again, inhale, exhale, and perhaps most importantly, Rendlesham became a story that would not die. In America, Roswell had grown into folklore. Now Britain had its own. Television specials played the Halt tape, his clipped military voice narrating the lights. Documentaries walked viewers through the forest, pointing at the exact spots where indentations were found, where beams of light had pierced the ground. Journalists interviewed locals who remembered the sudden flurry of activity that winter. Children grew up hearing of Rendlesham. Adults debated it in offices. Researchers cataloged it endlessly. And as the decades passed, the case did not fade into obscurity. It grew larger, because each year that passed without a clear explanation made the silence louder. Each year that witnesses repeated their stories without contradiction made them more credible. Each year that skeptics relied on the word lighthouse seemed thinner, weaker, less able to erase the awe of that December night. Close your eyes. Imagine the forest as it must have felt to those men. Imagine the beams of light between the trees. Imagine how those images, once described on paper and tape, became the seeds of a story that would spread across the world. Rendlesham Forest was no longer just a place in Suffolk. It was now one of the most famous forests in the world, a forest forever linked to the possibility that we are not alone. Every great mystery draws a shadow. For every witness who speaks, there is a skeptic who answers. For every tape that preserves a voice, there is an argument to explain it away. The Rendlesham Forest case, no matter how luminous its details, was no different. Because while many leaned forward with awe, others leaned back with dismissal. They had a simple word for the lights in Rendlesham, a word that carried no mystery, no alien craft, no beams from the sky. A lighthouse. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Let the word rest in your mind. Ordinary, predictable, the kind of explanation that feels safer than the unknown. Just east of Rendlesham, across the Suffolk coast, stood the Orford Ness Lighthouse. Its beams swept rhythmically across the horizon, a familiar presence to locals, a sentinel of light against the night sea. To skeptics, this lighthouse was the heart of the mystery. They said the men, disoriented in the dark forest, mistook its rhythmic flash for something unearthly. They said the glowing orbs were stars twinkling low through the branches, distorted by cold air and adrenaline. They said the strange movements were tricks of perspective, the darting lights, nothing more than meteors streaking across the winter sky. They said memory itself had twisted, reshaping fear into fantasy, and so skeptics leaned on the simplest story. No craft, no symbols, no beams, only a lighthouse and the human mind, ever eager to weave wonder from ordinary threads. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. But believers were not so easily convinced, because a lighthouse does not leave triangular impressions pressed into frozen soil. A lighthouse does not raise radiation readings in measured points where something heavy once rested. A lighthouse does not send narrow beams of light into a weapons facility, witnessed by trained officers. A lighthouse does not shimmer with colored orbs that split, rejoin, and move between trees. And perhaps most importantly, a lighthouse had been there for centuries. It had never before sparked such panic, such certainty, such detail. Why then, in December of 1980, would it suddenly confuse men trained to guard bases and watch skies? The arguments rippled across decades. Documentaries pitted one voice against another. Skeptics pointing to the beam sweeping across the forest. Believers pointing to Halt's voice on tape, steady, certain, describing something that moved, something that descended, something that split and danced. Skeptics leaned on psychology. They said men in darkness, under stress, often see what they expect or what they fear. Lights become crafts, shadows become movement, fear becomes memory. But believers answered that these were not ordinary men. These were military personnel, trained to stay calm, trained to observe, trained to report. If they could not trust their own eyes, what could they trust? And so, Rendlesham became not only a story of lights in a forest, but of two worlds colliding, the world of certainty and the world of mystery. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Feel the tension between them. Because skepticism is not the enemy of mystery. Skepticism sharpens it. Skepticism ensures the story survives not only in whispers of believers, but in debates that stretch across decades. The lighthouse theory endures. It is repeated still. And yet, the story of Rendlesham endures with equal strength because the men themselves, the ones who walked among the trees, never accepted the easy answer. Jim Penniston did not say he touched a lighthouse. John Burroughs did not say beams of light wrapped around him from the coast. Colonel Halt did not narrate a lighthouse splitting into orbs, darting between the trees, shining down beams like molten metal. They said what they saw. They said what they felt. They said what left them forever changed. And so the debate continues, as all great mysteries do, balanced between the comfort of the ordinary and the awe of the extraordinary. Breathe slowly now. Inhale. Exhale. Because Rendlesham is not only about what was seen, it is about what we choose to believe. Mysteries are not carried by forests. They are carried by people. Rendlesham Forest remained the same. Tall pines, sandy soil, quiet paths. The trees held their silence. The ground bore its marks for a season and then healed. But the men who walked into those woods in December 1980 did not heal so easily, because memory does not fade as quickly as footprints. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine being one of those men, young, disciplined, trained, and yet touched by something that stripped away everything you thought you knew. For Jim Penniston, the burden was the symbols. He carried them not only in sketches, but in his mind, etched as firmly as the craft itself. Years later, when he revealed the binary code that flooded into his thoughts, many mocked him. Some called it an invention, a desperate attempt to reignite a fading mystery. But those who knew him saw the truth in his eyes. The code was not a choice. It was a weight he had carried silently for decades, a whisper that refused to let him rest. For John Burroughs, the burden was his body. The lights had been more than sight, they had been contact. He remembered standing inside the glow, enveloped in a presence that seemed alive. Decades later, his health began to fail. Heart problems, radiation-linked conditions. Doctors puzzled. Officials stalled. He fought long battles for recognition, demanding that what happened in the forest be acknowledged, not only as memory, but as harm. Eventually, after years of persistence, he became the first man ever to win a case against the U.S. government for medical compensation linked to a UFO encounter. And then there was Colonel Charles Halt. He never wanted to be the face of this mystery. He was a career officer, steady, meticulous, dedicated to duty. Yet the forest gave him no choice. His voice on the tape ensured he would always be remembered. His words, clipped and steady, would echo long after his service ended. And so he carried it into retirement, into interviews, into late years where he repeated the same truth. I know what I saw. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Feel the exhaustion of repeating yourself year after year, knowing that half the world laughs, while the other half leans closer in belief. But perhaps the burden was not only theirs. Other men, unnamed, carried smaller fragments. Guards who whispered to wives in quiet kitchens. Locals who remembered the sudden flurry of military vehicles. Police who filed routine reports about strange lights, never knowing they were touching history. Each carried a piece, each marked by the silence. And then there was the ridicule. The press loved the phrase Britain's Roswell, but laughter followed just as quickly. Skeptics mocked. Journalists spun tales of confusion. Debunkers pointed again and again to the lighthouse, reducing extraordinary moments to ordinary beams of light. Families endured whispers. Children grew up hearing their fathers called liars. Wives listened to husbands retell stories late at night, voices trembling with the need to be believed. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Feel that loneliness, because belief is not easy when the world is waiting to laugh. And yet, through it all, the men never changed their stories. Not once. Not in detail, not in tone. They repeated the same events, the lights, the craft, the symbols, the beams, the silence. That endurance became its own form of evidence. For lies bend under pressure. Inconsistencies multiply over decades, but truth, however strange, often holds steady. And so, the burden of memory became also a gift of endurance, a legacy not chosen but lived. The men of Rendlesham carried it with them into old age. Their voices slowed, their hair grayed, but their eyes still lit with the same awe, the same haunted silence when they spoke of that night. Because some nights never end. Rendlesham was one of them. Mysteries do not only belong to those who lived them. They grow, they travel, they take root in the minds of strangers, thousands of miles away, who never touched the soil of the forest, or felt the glow of the lights, but who carry the story as if it were their own. Rendlesham became such a story. After the Halt memo surfaced, after the tape began to circulate, the case escaped Suffolk. It escaped the bases. It escaped even the men who had lived it. It became part of culture. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the journey from a frozen night in 1980 to a world where the story is told in books, in films, in television specials, in late-night radio, in whispers across generations. Documentaries came first. In the 1980s and 1990s, producers traveled to Suffolk, their cameras cutting through the forest just as flashlights once had. They interviewed witnesses, replayed Halt's voice, pointed to the indentations in the soil. Grainy recreations showed men stumbling through trees, lights pulsing, beams striking the ground. Audiences sat in living rooms, transfixed. Some laughed, others leaned closer, but no one forgot. Books followed. Researchers, investigators, journalists all wrote their versions. Some leaned toward belief, piecing together every testimony, every measurement, every official document. Others leaned toward doubt, insisting on the lighthouse, on meteors, on the fragility of memory. But each book, whether believer or skeptic, kept the story alive. Then came the conferences. Rendlesham became a touchstone, a story always on the program, always debated, always revisited. Peniston, Burroughs, Halt. They stood at podiums, voices steady, eyes reflecting the same memory decades later. Behind them, projected images of the forest, the craft, the symbols. Before them, audiences filled with seekers, skeptics, wanderers hungry for mystery. And then television. Late-night hosts invited the witnesses. Radio shows like Coast to Coast AM replayed the tape for insomniacs who found comfort in the idea that the unknown was awake with them in the night. Rendlesham's legend spread across oceans, across cultures, across languages. It became firmly Britain's Roswell. The nickname carried weight. In America, Roswell had become folklore. In Britain, Rendlesham filled that role. Both cases were unsolved. Both were debated endlessly. Both held official documents and enduring witnesses. Together, they stood as twin pillars of UFO lore, one across the Atlantic, one across the North Sea. Breathe again. Inhale, exhale. Imagine being a child in the 1990s, hearing about Rendlesham for the first time. A forest not far from where you lived, a night not long before you were born, filled with lights, with mystery, with silence. Imagine how such a story could shape your wonder, could make you look up at the stars differently. And then came film. The Rendlesham story inspired dramatizations, appearances in UFO specials, even mentions in fictional shows. It became part of the larger narrative of contact, woven into the same fabric as Roswell, as Phoenix, as Travis Walton, as Betty and Barney Hill. Every retelling softened the edges of skepticism. Because while doubt can erase a detail, it cannot erase repetition. The more Rendlesham was told, the more real it became in the minds of those who heard it. And so, culture adopted it, not only as a UFO story, but as a bedtime story. Because there is something dreamlike in the thought of lights moving through trees. Something calming, even as it unsettles. Something that soothes, even as it bewilders. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Let the forest fill your imagination again, not as a place of fear, but as a place of wonder. A place where the ordinary world opens to something larger, something unknown, something eternal. That is how Rendlesham lives now, not only in documents, not only in tapes, but in imaginations, in whispers, in dreams. Time changes everything, but not Rendlesham. The forest still stands. The trees have grown taller, paths have shifted, seasons have turned. But the story of that cold December night in 1980 has not faded into the soil. It has grown louder, because each decade since has carried the same weight, the weight of the unexplained. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the passing years, each one like a ring inside a tree trunk, layering new voices, new arguments, new attempts to make sense of what happened. In the 2000s and 2010s, the case was revisited again and again. New documentaries, new books, new interviews. Old witnesses repeated their stories. New researchers re-examined the evidence. The Halt memo and the Halt tape were scrutinized line by line, word by word, as though hidden meaning might suddenly emerge after decades. And still, two worlds faced each other, the world of skeptics and the world of believers. Skeptics remained firm in their explanations. They pointed once more to the lighthouse, to the Orford Ness beam sweeping through the trees. They argued that excited young men mistook it for something extraordinary, that Peniston's symbols were imagined, that Burroughs's health problems were coincidence, that Halt, even as a colonel, allowed himself to be carried away by adrenaline and suggestion. They leaned on psychology. Memory is fragile, they said. Over decades, details bend, merge, evolve. The Rendlesham witnesses had repeated their stories so often that their minds might have fused belief with imagination. And yet, believers remained just as steady. They pointed to the indentations in the soil, measured carefully the day after the first encounter. They pointed to the radiation readings, higher in the depressions than anywhere else. They pointed to Halt's calm voice on tape. Not the tone of a man fooled by a lighthouse, but the tone of a man describing something beyond training, beyond comprehension. They pointed to Burroughs's government acknowledgement of radiation-linked illness. They pointed to Peniston's binary code, strange coordinates that seemed too precise to dismiss. And they asked the same question skeptics could not silence. If this was only a lighthouse, why did it leave men shaken for life? Why, after 40 years, did they never abandon their story? Close your eyes. Inhale, exhale. Feel the weight of that endurance, because endurance itself becomes evidence. In the modern era, Rendlesham has become more than a case. It has become a debate that will never be settled, a touchstone in every discussion of UFOs, a reminder that some mysteries do not fade, but grow sharper with time. The world itself has changed. Governments have released new files. The Pentagon has admitted to investigating unidentified aerial phenomena. Pilots have stepped forward with their own accounts, recorded on modern instruments, captured on radar and camera. The stigma around UFOs has begun to soften. And in this new climate, Rendlesham shines again. Because it is no longer only a story from 1980. It is a piece of a larger puzzle, one that now includes Navy videos, congressional hearings, and official statements that the skies may hold more than we have admitted. For some, this strengthens belief in Rendlesham. They say the forest lights were an early chapter in a story that continues to this day. For others, it changes nothing. Skeptics still lean on the lighthouse, still call it confusion, still dismiss the witnesses as mistaken. And so the debate endures. It endures because Rendlesham is not about proof. It is about possibility. Close your eyes deeper. Inhale, exhale. The possibility that trained men carrying radios and flashlights walked into a forest and saw something not of this world. The possibility that beams of light touched a weapons facility in the heart of the Cold War. The possibility that a craft rested among trees in Suffolk, leaving behind marks in the earth and memories in men. That possibility is enough to keep the story alive. And so, as the decades pass, Rendlesham remains, not solved, not erased, but remembered. Because some mysteries live longer than the skeptics who deny them, longer than the believers who defend them. Rendlesham has become one of those mysteries, a story passed like a torch, carried from 1980 into today, still flickering with the same strange, steady light. Not every story survives because it can be proven. Some survive because they touch something deeper. A Rendlesham Forest incident has lived for more than 40 years, not only in documents, tapes, or debates, but in imaginations, in late-night whispers, in dreams, because Rendlesham is not only about whites in a forest, it is about us. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Let the forest surround you in your mind, the tall pines, the cold air, the silence that waits like a living presence. On one level, the case is simple. Men saw lights, men were shaken, men recorded their story. Skeptics answered, believers defended. Files were filed away. But on another level, Rendlesham is a mirror. It reflects our hunger for certainty, the desire to know what happened in those woods. And it reflects our hunger for wonder, the need to believe that the universe still holds mysteries waiting to be revealed. That is why the story lingers, because it speaks to both fear and hope. Fear because the thought of a craft descending silently into a forest is unsettling. Fear because beams of light aimed at a military base in the Cold War suggest a power beyond our control. Fear because we cannot explain it. And hope because if what those men saw was real, then we are not alone. Hope because the universe may be alive with intelligence beyond our imagination. Hope because our lives may be part of something far greater than routine and repetition. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. This is why Rendlesham has become more than an event. It has become a bedtime story, not for children, but for all of us. A story told softly in the dark. A story that calms, even as it unsettles. A story that allows us to drift into sleep, carried by possibility. Because dreams, like UFOs, are places where certainty dissolves. where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where silence becomes presence. When we hear of Rendlesham, we do not only imagine lights in trees. We imagine our own place beneath the stars. We imagine that the sky above us is alive, watching, aware. Perhaps that is the true meaning of the forest. Not proof, not denial, but wonder. Wonder that life is more mysterious than we admit. Wonder that silence can hold truth. Wonder that we are small, and yet chosen to glimpse something vast. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. For the men of Rendlesham, it was a burden. For the rest of us, it has become a gift. A gift of mystery. A gift of possibility. A gift of wonder that still whispers across the decades. And perhaps in the end, that is why the story endures. Because life is not only about knowing, it is also about wondering. And Rendlesham reminds us that wonder still walks among the trees. Time moves on, even when memories do not. The forest remains unchanged, its tall trees reaching for the sky, its paths winding quietly through soil that has long since healed. But for the men who walked into Rendlesham on those nights in 1980, the forest never truly let them go. Because some experiences are not left behind, they are carried. Breathe slowly, inhale, exhale. Imagine being one of those men, young then, steady, confident, trained. And now, decades later, older, slower, looking back on a night that refuses to fade. Jim Peniston still remembers the symbols. He has told his story countless times, sketched the markings again and again, spoken of the binary code that poured into his mind. For him, the encounter was not a single moment, but an imprint, a message carried silently for years before he dared reveal it. Skeptics mocked him. Believers studied his code, tracing coordinates, searching for meaning. Yet behind every retelling is the same steady truth. He carries what he cannot deny. John Burroughs carries the encounter in his body. His fight for recognition, for compensation, for acknowledgement that the forest left him changed, became a battle that stretched across decades. He did not seek fame, he sought understanding. And though the struggle was long, the eventual acknowledgement that radiation exposure had altered his health was itself historic. Proof that what happened in Rendlesham was not only seen, but felt. And Colonel Charles Halt, the man whose calm voice narrated the impossible on tape, carries the weight of command. He did not ask to lead men into mystery. He did not ask for his name to become tied to UFO lore. But duty pushed him into the forest, recorder in hand, and history followed. In interviews, in conferences, in quiet reflections, his words never changed. I know what I saw. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Feel the endurance in those words. Because that endurance is the true legacy of Rendlesham. Decades later, long after newspapers yellowed and documentaries faded, the men themselves remain. Not perfect, not beyond contradiction, but steady. Their stories have not collapsed. Their voices have not faltered. They are older now, their hair gray, their voices softer, their eyes carrying the weight of years. And still, when they speak of that winter, the silence of the forest fills the room. For them, the memory is both wound and legacy. A wound because ridicule never ceased, because laughter and doubt followed them through the years, because skeptics still point to the lighthouse, to meteors, to memory's fragility, and a legacy, because their names are tied forever to one of the most famous UFO encounters in history, because they became the bridge between silence and story, between forest and world. Breathe again. Inhale, exhale. For the rest of us, Rendlesham is a story. For them, it is life. And as they step into later years, their testimony becomes more than evidence. It becomes inheritance, a memory they pass on to the next generation, to those who will keep whispering of lights in the Suffolk woods. The forest does not speak. The soil holds no answers. But the men do, and their words endure. The forest has always been patient. It was there long before men built bases beside it, long before boots pressed into its soil, long before lights flickered between its trees. It has carried centuries of silence, centuries of shadows, centuries of stories whispered only to the wind. And yet, in December of 1980, Rendlesham was no longer just a forest. It became a threshold. Because in those nights, something entered the silence, something that left men shaken, left soil marked, left memory etched forever, something that turned an ordinary forest into a place known around the world. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Let yourself walk there now, in your mind. The path is quiet beneath your feet. The pines stretch above you, tall and steady. The air is sharp with winter's edge. And somewhere in the distance, a memory stirs, faint lights shifting between the trees, a whisper of awe in the darkness. The details have been debated endlessly. Was it a craft? Was it lights reflected from the coast? Was it memory bending under the weight of fear and wonder? No answer has silenced the questions. No theory has erased the awe. And perhaps that is the point. Because Rendlesham endures not as proof, but as presence. A presence felt by those men who walked into the woods, their hearts pounding, their voices steady on tape. A presence felt by all who have heard the story since, leaning closer in the dark, listening for echoes in their own lives. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. The forest is still there. The soil no longer bears indentations. The trees no longer show burns. But in memory, in culture, in dreams, the lights still hover. They hover above the pines. They hover above the silence. They hover above us all, reminders of how vast the sky truly is. For Peniston, Burroughs, Halt, and the others, Rendlesham was a moment that shaped a lifetime. For the rest of us, it is a story that shapes our wonder. It tells us that mystery still breathes among us. It tells us that the world is larger than certainty. It tells us that even in silence, there is presence. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Let the story settle into your chest like a gentle weight. The forest is quiet now. Only the wind moves between the trees. Only the stars gleam above. And yet, if you close your eyes, you can still see it. A glow between the branches. A craft resting silently. On three legs. A beam of light piercing the night. The forest remembers. The men remember. And now you remember too. So rest. Let Rendlesham carry you into sleep, as it has carried so many before. Because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered. And this one will be. Good night.